Yo, everybody. Welcome to Off Panel, a weekly interview podcast about all things comics, brought to you by Sketch.com. I'm your host, David Harper, and this week's guest is the cartoonist behind Mobilis at TKO Studios and the artist of the unlikely story of Felix and Macabber at Dark Horse. It's Juni Ba. Thanks for coming on, Juni.
Hello, thanks.
So it is a big week in a big month for you. You have 2 graphic novels released in October alone. How are you feeling? Are you excited? Are you ready? Are you over it because you're already through a bunch of pages that are already hiding behind you?
I'm disconnected. It's weird. Every book that comes out, I've finished at least a year prior. So my brain isn't really into them anymore. It's into the next, the current thing I'm working on. So it's kind of weird because it's like looking back at a past version of yourself every time. Who is the person who made this book and for what reason and what was going into the different decisions of the story choices and how they were told. So every discussion I have, especially about Mobilis, is very it's kind of like talking to people about this piece of my own brain that I put into paper, kind of. It was very related to my own therapy and stuff that happened to me in the past 3 years. So it's kind of Mobilis was a bit of me trying to make something out of all the stuff that happened, and now it's out, and I get to talk to people about what they thought of my own summary, I guess, of all the emotions that I went through.
It really did feel like something that found you kind of dealing with the emotions of the pandemic and everything that was connected to it and everything, the circumstances and everything like that. But I do think that one of the interesting things about all of this, like what you're talking about, it's not just you trying to look back on the finished product, but also it's you finished Mobilis over a year ago. So when did you start it? Or when did you first conceive it? That could have been 2 years ago, 3 years ago? I don't even know.
I mean, I read the book when I was 21 and I'm 31 now.
Mm-hmm.
So when I read the book, that's when I got interested in Nemo as a character archetype. And that's when I drew Nemo for the first time. So that was about 10 years ago. And then the story itself, the idea for the book itself came about in 2020 during a panic attack because I thought, I couldn't breathe anymore, and I thought I was gonna die. And what my brain was doing was that it was coming up with flashes of images of Nemo in his ship with his crew stealing pieces of art and offering them to some kind of weird god under the sea. And the ideas came from that. And then in 2021, I got into a similar situation as Nemo and Arona of you're trapped in one space interacting with the same person all the time, but that person isn't necessarily super mentally healthy. So gradually it starts getting at you. And that's when it gave me the idea for, we're going to get rid of the entire crew and he's just going to be interacting with one person and she's going to be our into what's going on and what happened to him. And we get to see his mindset and how he works through her, which keeps the secret of the mystery of Nemo. Essentially, he's kind of like Gandalf. You never want to use him as the center of your story because he breaks all the mystery around him. You want to have someone else who doesn't really know what he's about.
I love it when things are like that. There's so many examples for that. I've been reading a bunch of Star Wars books written by Timothy Zahn, and he's the person who created that character, Thrawn. I don't know if you know Thrawn. Yeah, and Thrawn is interesting because he's the person who like Gandalf, has all of the answers. And so it's if you get in his brain, it's going to break the story because you're going to see it from all the angles at once. So you always have to tell it from somebody around him or somebody in his orbit or something like that. And it is interesting when you have to do that with stories. It's with Mobilis, you're talking about, you have Arona, who is introduced to this world, is the first step into it, and helps us understand everything that's going on. And you start kind of getting the layers peeled back as she starts to understand it. And if you did it any other way, it kind of would have, I don't know. I mean, it probably would have been a shorter book, that's for sure.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of the reason was also this idea of, for me, the experience that led to this idea was this thing of you meet someone and gradually you start to discover more aspects of themselves that they didn't necessarily show at first. And you try to make sense of this really difficult to manage person that you have in front of you. A lot of the situations that I had in this book, especially the ones where Arona and Nemo are having a really good time and then he just changes on like in a flash because of one trigger or whatever. A lot of that came from those types of situations of you're trying to build some type of a link, a bond to someone, and that there's this thing in their head that makes it so difficult to get to them.
Mm-hmm.
And at some point, you also get into the issue of whether that person actually wants to get rid of the thing in their head or not, and why they don't want to do that. And the fact that you will never really understand because you're not in their head and you have no control over the decisions that they decide to make. Like, especially the ending of the book is really about that. Like this whole thing of being powerless to get someone to make what you see as a better, more healthy decisions, and all the pain that comes from the fact that you also know that they're not a bad person anyway. They're just trying to make sense of what's going on too.
I do think it's interesting looking at both this and The Unlikely Story of Felix and Macabber, because I'm not going to say that they're similar books or that they necessarily are doing the same things, but I think both of them, there's like this focus to some, or like from the outside, from my perspective, it kind of felt like different generation, or like a focus on different generations and passing on knowledge to those that follow you. And also just kind of like the inscrutability of the people in your life and trying to figure things out.
Yeah.
It's not the exact same thing, but I do kind of feel like you touch on similar territory within those two books. And I don't know if that was by intent or by accident, because I know you worked with Hassan Otsmane-Elhaou on Felix and Macabber, but there was some similarity between the two of them in my mind.
A lot of it comes from the fact that like it's kind of the same things that inspired the two books, in that when we started working on Felix, we had a lot of discussions about our dads. And when I started working on Mobilis, I actually remember telling a friend, I'm writing a book and Nemo is your dad. Like a lot of the discussions that we had about, especially like African dads, because like Hass's dad is from Algeria, my other friend's dad is from like Tunisia, and mine is from Senegal. And there's a lot of like similar, I mean, I guess technically you can find this archetype anywhere in the world of like the emotionally blocked dad, I want to say. And so, yeah, so when I was working on Mobilis, there was a lot of that as well, of like, I really want him to be this embodiment of a generation that didn't necessarily know how to handle the mind stuff, like the emotional stuff. And especially with a man more so than a woman, there's a lot of like, you have to be tough and you don't convey your emotions, and sometimes you're not even really aware that you have them. And with Felix, it was really a book about Macabber's regrets and trying to figure out how to repair the mistakes he made. Whereas with Nemo, it's a lot more someone who doesn't even really want to admit that he has any mistakes in the first place. I could make an entire like book about the psychology of this character and how he wants to perpetuate his own mythology in a way.
So before we get further into these two books, I did want to talk about the sequencing, because I do think that's interesting. I'm going to walk through some of your recent past, at least from the outsider perspective. So Mobilis and Felix and Macabber are arriving the same month, October. Monkey Meat ended in May of 2022, release date wise, but I know that was a much earlier project for you, at least in part.
Yeah.
And so that gives us a gap of about a year and 5 months separating you from your last big release, your last kind of like, I don't want to say pure you thing. You've done like 3 Worlds, 3 Moons, where you've drawn and you've kind of brought your own vibe to it and everything like that. But it's sort of a different beast in that regard. Now you have 2 books in 20 days. I'm curious as to like what the sequencing was for these projects. Which one did you work on first? Was it Felix and Macabber? Was it Mobilis? Were you working on them simultaneously? How did it work?
I'm always working on like 3 books at the same time.
I'm not gonna lie, that seems unhealthy. How do you do that?
But I mean, Felix, we've been working on it for like 7 years on and off.
Oh, wow.
Like it's older than Jelia. Felix is older than Jelia. And we just stopped and got back onto it and then stopped again on and off for like several years. Actually, what happened is that I pitched Mobilis to Dark Horse. They took a long time to respond. And in the meantime, TKO was like, do you have a new book you want to give us? And I said, well, I have this one and I haven't heard back yet. In the same afternoon, TKO signed Mobilis. And then Dark Horse contacted me again and said, yeah, we're going to take this book. And I had to say, well, it has already been optioned by TKO, but I have this one about like monsters and wrestling and masculinity and stuff. Do you want this one? And they said yes. So Felix was done, maybe. I think the coloring was left, maybe. And yeah, so I did both of them sort of at the same time, but Felix was almost finished at that point anyway. Just to give you an idea of like the time frame for Mobilis, I drew the actual final pages. I drew them over like 3 months, which was like half the time it took me for Gelia. And which is funny because like it has like twice the amount of detail. But yeah, so that gives you an idea. Like I was done with Mobilis fairly quickly.
Did you and Haas basically come up with Felix and Macabber shortly after you started watching Strip Pale Naked?
Yeah.
Wow. The distance between discovering Strip Pale Naked and like working together is pretty short, but I guess you guys quickly understood that you spoke the same language.
Yeah, because like the way it happened is that he made 1 or 2 videos and I saw them and I was using them as like guidelines for my graduation project. And once I had graduated, I sent him an email that essentially said, this is what I made. It was thanks to you. And if you know anyone that might be interested by this, you please like share. And he responded, actually, we're going to do a book together. But at the time, like, I don't think he was even a letterer yet. And I just graduated from school. So we were literal nobodies. And we just had to wait, I guess. So in the meantime, we did work on the book. We almost got it published with a British publishing house that was using a crowdfunding system, but it didn't pan out. And then years later, Dark Horse took it. So it just needed to we just needed to have our own careers, I guess, so that people would give this book a bit more attention.
Mm-hmm. The interesting thing, and the reason why I ask this is this isn't diminishing Felix and Macabber in any ways. It's just a different thing. But even though Mobilis came out first, which is the funny part about this, Mobilis feels like a kind of next step for you in terms of visual storytelling. And maybe that's me reading too much into it, but it just feels like there's this clarity of storytelling to it. And like Felix Macabber, the thing I love about it is it's got so much raw energy to it. Like you read like those early pages and there's just ideas on the page. And like Mobilis is really tight in a way that I don't think that like Monkey Meat or Gelia or Felix and Macabber is. That doesn't mean it's better, but it just feels different. Do you feel like you learned a lot from the projects ahead of Mobilis that made it different because you're a different artist? Or do you think that it's, that clarity that I'm talking about is really there because it's just what the story needed?
Kind of both. So like Felix was storyboarded and most of it drawn about 7 years ago.
Right. There's a different you.
Yeah, exactly. Like it's actually kind of funny looking at the pages because I can see the difference in line work and even the way I would have framed certain things. And there's also the fact that like Mobilis was made with a very I called it when I was making it, I called it my A24 book. Like I really wanted this one to be sort of like the prestige, pretentious type of book about like, literature, character and long sequences without dialogue, but I didn't want it to be too flashy and either. I didn't want it to be like full of like I didn't want to play with the form too much. I wanted it to be focused on telling its story and not trying to convince you that I'm so great because I came up with all kinds of weird things that I could do with my art. So yeah, so a lot of it was more tight, I guess is the good word. Yeah. Like a lot of it was more tight. So there's a lot of, for example, there's a layout that I'm using throughout the book where it's the same size panels inside the Nautilus, and then when you're outside, it changes into a much more fluid form. So yeah, so I had guidelines. Like I think even the sketchbook that I have I make a sketchbook for every project, and for Mobilis, I had a page where there's loads of notes about the size of the panels, the type of layouts that I was going to use, the different types of fonts and everything. And it was sort of like, this is the rule book. Everything you do from now on needs to adhere to these rules, and you need to follow this throughout the book. And whenever you break them, it has to be for a reason.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. So how do you use those sketchbooks in general? Is it just like, is that ideas and rules and things like that? Is that where you do your layouts? Like, how do you use that?
Yeah, there's a lot of like, the way I work is kind of holistic in that I don't necessarily sit down with a schedule of, okay, from 8 to 9, I'm going to work on this. It's more so that I have a sketchbook, and whenever an idea pops up, I make a note of it. A lot of it is sketches, actually. It's scribbles and doodles of stuff. And often I will actually sit down and try to figure out everything that my brain has been coming up with for days or weeks or whatever. But the sketchbooks are usually for the sake of gathering every little idea I have into one place and then trying to make sense of all of them, figuring out which ones actually work and how they can work together, and making small layouts of the pages. And then I do the rest digitally, of like on the file of the right page size, I make an actual layout. And if I have an editor, that's what I send them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So most of the time the sketches are for that. Like it's a way for me to have an object that I can gather everything related to one project into, and that I can go back to anytime I want to add even like a line or two of dialogue that I came up with at 3 a.m.
So you have project-specific sketchbooks, but you also are often doing multiple projects at once. Do you just pack those with you everywhere you go, just in case like something comes up? Or is that just something, are the sketchbooks something you simply use at home and like that's where you put your ideas if they stick with you?
No, they go everywhere.
Yeah.
Yeah. The Jelia is Jelia and Mobilis. Jelia and Felix are actually the sketchbooks that are the most dented and destroyed, because I think I carried them everywhere for much longer than any other project since. But yeah, like they all look busted anyway because of that.
So when you have 3 projects at once, how do you figure out what's next? Like, is it based off of like deadlines or like desire from the publisher, or is it just based off of what speaks to you?
All of those things. If there's a deadline, of course, it takes precedence over everything. But most of the time, because I'm so ahead of time in schedules, I just do whatever I feel like doing at the moment, I guess. And then, of course, if there's a project that gets signed, it takes precedence because I want it to be done. But yeah, like a lot of my work is mostly driven by whatever I want to do.
So basically, if like somebody, let's say you're in the midst of working on project book behind you, we can't talk about, but then you have, I don't know, somebody like Mike Del Mundo or Jonathan Hickman emails you and says, hey, we want you to work on a 3 Worlds, 3 Moons thing. And if that strikes your fancy, if that's something that speaks to you, you're like, yeah, sure, I can do that.
Yeah, exactly.
I like it. So basically, it's, I mean, to be honest, I think that's where all creators and artists and everything want to be, is like, it seems like what guides you is the thing that speaks to you the most in the moment.
Yeah, there's a lot of like, they all said it's a job of passion, and I kind of agree, because you also need like the motivation to get up in the morning and do your pages and whatever other jobs you have to do around that. And it's much easier to do. It's not even easier to do when you actually feel it in your gut, like you have to do it. You wake up in the morning needing to do it. Like the project that I was talking about, like I was working on it for 2 weeks, but that's because I could not stop.
Yeah.
I had trouble getting into bed at night because I was still in the mode of I want to keep drawing, but I'm too tired to draw anything good. So I have to go to sleep so that I can be capable of drawing something in the morning tomorrow.
When you feel that creative push, that inner drive, do you find that you kind of binge the work and then like take some time off and then kind of binge the work? Is that how you kind of operate?
A lot of the time, yes. And I try to sort of pace it with 2 pages a day. Yeah. So that I can spend that day on those 2 pages and really focus on whatever things I didn't see or whatever. But yeah, like I ended up doing 4 pages instead on this one. So
some artists are going to listen to this and be like, what the hell is this guy? How does he do this?
I have a lot of tricks. I have made a very specific work process to do only the things that I want to do in the way that suits me. In my case, it's drawing the sketches on my iPad because it's easier. You can move things around however you want. And then I print it in blue lines on a piece of paper on a printer that I bought specifically for that, on artboards, and then I ink that.
Okay.
Yeah, like I developed a bunch of different things that just suit my particular brain, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I think everybody does. It's like you figure out your process as you go along and you streamline it as much as you can so you can get as much done without like burning yourself out. Obviously, yeah. a tough line. But last question in terms of like the projects you decide, do you prioritize books that you write and draw yourself?
Yeah.
That's your preferred way to go?
Yeah, a lot of the time. Because I keep coming up with new things. And even right now, like there's a book that I have pitched that I should sign soon. And I'm already thinking about the one after that because my brain just cannot stop. And because of that, there's a certain level of like, it's more satisfactory to work on something that I came up with rather than someone else's story. Mm-hmm. And it's not a matter of like thinking that my stories are better or anything. It's really just I don't know, they come from your own need to express something. So it comes, yeah, it's a lot more like needing to say, like needing to get something out of your system. And anything else is sort of like forcing you to propose, I guess, on the stuff that needs to come out.
Do you find that covers are kind of exempt from that because it's just you doing what you want with the idea, and it's not really, you don't really have a writer or an artist, or you do have an artist, but it's like, it isn't defined roles. It's just you executing a vision for a book, and like that's, you're kind of free from what happens on the inside.
Yeah, it's a different thing in the sense that like it's an illustration, so you sort of have to figure out something to convey in one image. It's a different exercise, I guess, and I like it for that reason. Like the last I did, I think, was the Transformers one, and just coming up with the idea of like Optimus and replacing the matrix of leadership, I think it's called.
Yep.
Replacing the matrix of leadership with the Earth, and like it's just I don't know. You spend an afternoon drawing your thing, and it's really nice, and then you can get back to the rest of your job, I guess.
I love that cover. It was really good. I wrote about it because it was the idea of putting the Earth there was just very Optimus Prime. It was good stuff. I know I'm pretty sure Daniel Warren Johnson was over the moon about that one too.
And now, a quick word from one of our sponsors. Do you wish that buying and reading digital comics was even easier? Well, I have good news. Omnibus is here for you. Omnibus is a modern digital comic book store and reader app carrying your favorite single issues, volumes, and omnibuses, all day and date. They're pay per book, just like your LCS, but digital, so you're already used to the experience. Their focus is on building an excellent customer shopping and reading experience and using novel discovery features to help fans find their next new favorite book. They feature top-tier content and already have many of the top publishers in comics today on board. Want to find the right digital comic shop for you? Download Omnibus today on the Apple App Store to do just that. And now, back to the show.
Let's talk about Mobilis in specific to start with. It's your latest solo book. It's your new graphic novel over at TKO. Here's the solicit. You can take this one off. I'll do this for a bit. It has been centuries since the oceans rose and swallowed up all the nations of men. Now only beasts and unseen horrors lurk below the waves, kept in check by one man, Captain Nemo, and his legendary ship, the Nautilus. Until one day, young Arona comes on board his ship, a stowaway from times long past, giving Nemo his first crew member in years. But as he raises the young orphan in his image, she begins to have questions that ask Nemo to dredge up the past. What has become of the world? Can it be saved? And was it all worth it? So I'm going to share my take on this soon, but I wanted to start with this. You mentioned how you read Jules Verne's 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea when you were 21. And so like you had that idea in there, like you knew that this story was like something that you wanted to do something with. Was it always Captain Nemo? Was like that always the draw to you specifically from the book? I guess what was the appeal of Captain Nemo as a character? Was it more that he fit the type of story you wanted to tell, or was it there's something specific you wanted to explore about the character?
So, okay, to give you an idea, because I think for me, it really came about at a very specific moment in the book that I don't think is even seen in the Disney movie that they made in like the 50s or whatever, where he's been complaining about the world of men for the entirety of the book at this point, about how society is corrupted and he basically left the world of men behind because he doesn't care about it anymore. But at one point, Professor Aronnax, the hero, sees him help a bunch of rebels by giving them weapons or money or something like that. And I loved that moment because he was sort of like, it's the contradiction of Nemo, essentially. He's this really gruff guy who is immensely intelligent, has he has an enormous brain. He speaks all the different languages in the world so well that you can't even tell which one is his actual like birth language. It's impossible to tell where he comes from because physically he doesn't look like he comes from anywhere. Even his name means no one. So like he's a walking mystery who keeps saying that the world of men is useless and disappointing, and that's why he doesn't like it. But he still has enough of a conscience that he wants to give back some of what he has to people in need who are fighting some kind of fascist government somewhere. And I love that about him, like this idea of a guy who doesn't want to tell you what his weaknesses are and where his ideals can be bent. And it started like that, basically. Like I really like this idea of the guy because he's kind of the proto John Wick. That's kind of how I describe him, in that John Wick is this guy who's alone because he chose to. He's really cool. He's really strong. Everyone knows him and everyone has stories about him where he does insane things, but he's really humble about it and everything. So like a lot of his legend comes from how everyone treats him rather than himself.
Yes.
And he's a power fantasy for guys. He's a very specific type of power fantasy for guys. And Nemo is kind of like that. And I thought it would be interesting to have a story where you kind of interrogate, okay, what does that mean? And what, like that generation of guys who came up with this archetype of the guy who goes around the world, discovers stuff and is super intelligent, but also destroys stuff. Like he's from that generation who destroyed everything in the world, and he left because of that reason. But also, like in the end, you didn't really do anything useful. You just left. Like you present yourself as above them, but you didn't actually do anything to stop what they were doing.
It's like that meme, the guy with the cape from a anime where he's like, you know, it's like, my job here is done, and like the girl's like, you haven't done anything, and he's like, just flies off or whatever. I gotta say, I think you're probably the first person in history to compare Captain Nemo to John Wick. I like to think so, but yeah, I totally see what you're saying though, because it goes back to what we were talking about with, you need that character outside of them, because as badass as John Wick is, like the moments that really stand out about him being like the ultimate tough guy, especially in the first movie, are like, in the first movie, he calls the Russian mobster guy, the guy whose son killed his dog. He calls him, he doesn't say anything, and like the guy has this really animated conversation with him, and then afterwards, the one guy asks him, is like, oh, what did he say? He's like, enough, even though he said nothing. And the thing about it is like, it helps you understand just how intense and respected this person is. And like, it makes John Wick a mystery, but it also helps you understand like what his impact on the world is. And I guess like going to Arona in specific, there's a lot of different versions of those characters that kind of contextualize Nemo you could have put in there. I mean, it could have just been Kansei, who I just want to say is pretty incredible. Your version is like this Lost in Space style robot that is incredibly charming. What made Arona the foot into the door of this world that you really needed?
So I created her whole cloth mostly because I made her at the point where I was like, okay, I need someone to have a relationship with him that's, how do I put this? Someone who doesn't have the influence that he has, who doesn't have the experience that he has, and who is also in a position of being sort of, not subservient, but like, she's a child and he's an adult. So by definition, she's going to look to him as a source of like comfort or whatever. So like someone who can take care of her, because essentially they're both two people trying to create some kind of bond to someone else. And they just happen to be the only two people left. So the only option they have is each other. Right. Like she is introduced as someone who just lost her parents, and who, I think the line is something like, she can't go back to sleep because every time she wakes up, something bad has happened. Like she's clearly been hurt before. She's gone through some stuff, and she's faced with someone who is not emotionally capable of giving to anyone. And that was the heart of it, like me trying to process my own feelings of going through the same situation of being faced with someone who is emotionally unable to give to anyone. But there was also this element of the generational aspect of it. So I needed it to be a kid who interacts with an older Nemo who she doesn't have any reference for who he is. So we were talking about this whole thing of how people react to John Wick. What would happen if he was teamed up with a kid who doesn't know anything about his world? She would have no reference for who John Wick is, and she would not care. And every time he would try to assert his legend, she would be the first to be like, yeah, but you're just trying to create a vibe that doesn't actually exist, except because you have people who mirror the vibe you're trying to give. And Nemo is alone now. He doesn't have anyone to validate the way he views himself, and he's forced to interact with a kid who has the foresight to say, all the stuff that you value is the stuff that led to me losing everything I had.
Yeah.
So why would I see that as good? And so I'm going to force you to see the stuff in yourself that you don't want to look at negatively.
I think that is like one of the smartest things you did in this book, because if there was like a crew member, the crew member would understand Nemo and would understand his world, would understand all these things, but temporally and like spatially and existence wise, Arona is an outsider. And because she's an outsider, she it's funny, like there's all these parts. One of my favorite parts is the fact that they're always arguing. And the thing is Nemo just thinks that she's argumentative, but she's just like exposing all of his like kind of bullshit in a way.
Yeah.
And I really love that. I mean, like that's their relationship is really special.
Cool. So yeah, so you said you were going to give your take or your thoughts.
Oh yeah.
So I want to know.
Oh, so this is not me defaming any of your other books, but this is as to date your magnum opus. This is amazing. I absolutely was astonished reading this. It was just absolutely incredible. So, like I said, I'm not saying that it is like your other books are not good or something like that. But when I was reading this, I was just like, holy shit, like Juni has like stepped up to a new level. This is like, if you're a Pokemon, you hit your next evolution. And I was very impressed. So good job by you. I immediately went to my best comics of 2023 list and typed it in there because I was like, all right, I got to put this on there.
Nice. Because like I remember reading an article you made about the books you were expecting for the year. And there was a line in your paragraph about Mobilis where you said something like, I don't like every book he does, but all of them have a personality or whatever, like his own personality. And I was like, I hope he likes this one.
Well, that's the thing that I think is amazing about your work is now I have to figure out a way to say this doesn't sound like I'm like sassing other people. I read some comics and I'm like, a lot of people could have made this comic, but I read your comics and no one could have made it besides you. And like, that's something I really love about your work. But Mobilis, it really feels like you're kind of fully formed in a way that like is different. I'm sure that when I read your next stuff, I'll just like, Mobilis is bullshit. Like this new stuff is amazing. But I do think it's interesting though, because in a lot of ways, even though the other ones have a lot of connection to you, Mobilis feels the most personal in a very unusual way. And I think it ties back to like the fact that you were confronting the past few years and you're confronting that relationship where you were like in a space with somebody for a long time and you had to deal with the specific things. And I think that's part of the reason why Arona and Nemo feel so connected. And it's because like in a weird way, they're like connected by the fact that they're the only people left, but also they're connected through this like mutual love for each other, but also mutual disappointment in one another. And it makes it a really fascinating kind of go-between. And I guess I'm kind of curious, do you find that like you looking back on this book, is it more you dealing with the way the world was or the way your world was over those few years?
Kind of both, because the big world influences the small one.
That's true.
And there's a lot of like the anxieties that you have when you think about what's happening outside of your room then also influence how you feel about the inside and what you're dealing with on a daily basis. So yeah, I would say both. And like a lot of the books dialogues are either discussions I've had or therapy breakthroughs, I guess. Like there's one especially where Conseil tells her, don't try to save him from drowning or you're going to drown too, which is something that I told myself while I was essentially crying in the shower. And the weird thing about the artist's brain is that the second I had that thought, I was like, this should go in the book.
Wait, were you still in the shower as it happened?
Yeah.
Hey, at least it was a productive cry in the shower. Those are always the best.
Oh yeah, sure. I mean, it was productive in a lot of ways. Like I made several decisions during that moment that just led me to making a bunch of like changes in my life afterwards and cutting some stuff out of my life. And it also influenced the end of the book because I was like, Arona cannot do the stuff that I'm doing. She can't cut Nemo out of her life. She can't just get rid of the stuff that bothers her. And I think a lot of the elements, especially the stuff with Peter Pan, came from that as well. Of like, there's a lot of, it would be easy to just try to avoid looking at the problem and put yourself in a position where you're helpless and just suffering and essentially being the victim of what's happening. But you can also decide even if it hurts to like cut ties with the stuff that doesn't work for you. And in the case of Arona, there's like the difficulty of the person you're trying to get close to is not gonna go the same direction you want them to go. Yeah, and I'm trying not to spoil the end, but like a lot of stuff that was in the book was originally supposed to be more positive, and I decided it was kind of disingenuous, and the book had to end the way that it did because that's what felt true to me, like for the characters.
Okay, this is gonna go dangerous towards spoiler territory, but I didn't read it as a negative ending. Interesting.
I would say bittersweet, maybe. I don't know. There's a lot of like, I think it's because I identify with Arona a lot. And there's a lot of like, in a position like this, there's a lot of this desire for that person in front of you to understand your your point of view and essentially being closer the way you would have wanted, and it just does not happen.
Yeah.
And yeah, so I think the reason why I see it as very bittersweet is because she did not get what she wanted, and whether or not she got what she needed is debatable. And what's interesting to me is that everyone has a different view of what happened and what it meant and what the book essentially was saying at the end, which is very much how I wanted it to be. Again, it's my A24 book. I wanted it to be very artsy and everyone to come out of it with a different idea of what it was about.
I will say her life was definitely improved, at least in one way. She now knows who A Tribe Called Quest is.
True.
When that lyric came up, I was like, wait a second, is that A Tribe Called Quest? And you're like, she says something like, who said that? And he was like, oh, Fife. And I was just like, oh my God, Fife Dog reference in this? Oh, it was great. It was great. I do think that's the interesting thing about all of this is like tying into the ending, tying into that, tying into really everything. It's like also even to yourself, the interesting thing about their relationship. And the thing that part of the reason why I think the ending is a positive one, and we can talk about this after we stop recording, but I think the thing that's interesting about this, and also like Felix and Macabber to some degree, is that you can learn from the mistakes of the previous generation. And you can always take that and you can put your own spin on it and do what you need to do to make yourself right with the things that you're doing. And I think that's the thing about Arona that's really interesting is like she doesn't just blindly follow. She was a kid and this is the entire world she knows. And like it'd be entirely possible that she would just become this like, I don't know, zealot in support of Nemo, but instead she is her own person. And I think that's like the spicy stuff that really makes the whole thing work. I did want to ask about the design though. Nemo has been shown like 1,000,000 times. Kansei, at least to my knowledge, has never been a robot before. How did you come up with your own versions of these characters?
So Nemo was the first. So that was when I was like 10 years ago. I just grew what came to me when I was reading the book, mostly out of this idea that in the 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, there's no indication of where he comes from, and there's no physical description of what he looks like. And you're told that his appearance itself is very ambiguous. So I decided that he would be vaguely tanned, but he'd have blue eyes, and he would have this long beard that hides his face, and he would look vaguely Arabic or vaguely Indian. It's kind of difficult to tell. Like the whole idea was ambiguous in every possible way. And really square looking. So he was tall and he looked like, I think I took some design cues from like the characters that Bruce Timm would have drawn. Like his Justice League characters are all very square looking with very tiny legs. And it's kind of the same principle. Like what if Superman or Bruce Wayne was a scholar and dressed in a more casual, more formal. Arona was the opposite. So taking Nemo, I designed the opposite of him. I made a really thin with wild hair. And she also was meant to be very, not ambiguous so much, but like she's from somewhere in America. And she has some native blood, but it's kind of difficult to tell exactly if she's from the north or south. She has memories of a Native American culture. And that's why she has like face makeup and stuff like that. But again, it's difficult to tell exactly where. Also because I want it to be sort of universal in that way of like, yeah, she comes from the global south of the world where people are most suffering from the consequences of capitalism and ecological disasters and stuff. And Conseil is because a lot of the design for the tech was, I want to say, Apple inspired, like white and slick.
Yeah.
Instead of what you would have expected to be, which is the more steampunk kind of look with all the different, what's it called again? Anyway, everyone knows what steampunk looks like. Mm-hmm. Instead, I want the opposite way of like, I want it to look very slick. Like what if Nemo had designed everything in a way more modern world? And Conseil, however, even though it looks slick, I wanted it to have sort of a nostalgic vibe to it. And I've always been a fan of these robots from the old black and white movies and the first TV shows with science fiction things where people go into space and those types of robots where it was very obviously someone in a suit. Like he was either going to look like that or like a Dalek. So I went with that.
I feel like Dalek would have been a mixed message.
Yeah, exactly.
The Nautilus, I forgot to mention the Nautilus. The Nautilus is interesting too because it always looks different. Like you look at League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, way different. You look at Jules Verne's original stuff, way different. And yours kind of looks like a right whale, which I think is really funny. Maybe like a right whale mixed with like several other types of whales, but it's got like kind of barnacles coming off of it. And it's got all those, it feels very organic in a way that it doesn't always. I thought that was really interesting. But I wanted to bring up something you said in an interview about this book. This is a hardcover. This is an oversized hardcover. You mentioned specifically that that was something you needed to do this story right. Why is that?
The way I described it in the pitch, I think, was that I wanted some of the pages to punch you in the face.
I'm really glad I read digitally now because I don't think I could take a punch to the face.
Actually, that's also when I started saying that it was my pretentious book, because I took it from a Mobilis hardcover that I have here. The book is massive, and the great part of it is that you could really see the art that Mobilis was drawing in that book. And I took both the size of it and the layout from one of the stories that he had, and I based the entire storytelling of my book off of that. So I basically took everything from Mobius and then I applied it to what my story was going to be.
Yeah.
And it also influenced where the story was going to go in some ways, because it tells you how your story is going to be told, which is really useful. I'm doing the same thing right now with the new project where I'm stealing a bunch of stuff from the DC New Frontier and Catwoman.
Like the Darwin Cook one?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I love Darwin Cook's work. So I'm stealing a bunch of stuff from him, like storytelling-wise and design-wise as well. So yeah, I basically took a Mobius hardcover that I had and I took the dimensions of it. And in the pitch, I said the book needs to be this size because the pages need to look that way, so that when you're inside the Nautilus, I can have smaller panels and you don't have to squint. And when you're outside, I can really draw like lavish landscapes and massive monsters, and you get to actually feel the size of those things.
I love when you do the first spread where you just show the Nautilus. It's not the first spread, but it's like the Nautilus, and it has like that's really great. I am unsurprised, based off of all the things you've said about your own book, that did you pitch this to Sebastian Gerner from TKO? Yeah. I'm unsurprised he responded the same afternoon, given the fact that like A24, Mobius, all these different things. I'm sure Sebastian was like, oh my God, is this from my dream journal? What's happening here?
Yeah.
If it's somehow connected to Berserk, I'm pretty sure that you would have been like, he's like, we're going to do a 40-book series, stretch this out.
I mean, I'm lucky in that we have a lot of similar sensibilities.
Yeah, Sebastian's great.
Yeah.
Last question I have for you about Mobilis, and this you may not have an answer to. How did you get a pull quote from Riz Ahmed?
I don't know. Like it's all TKO. I have no idea how they did it. There's a bunch of so Zichan is the publisher of TKO.
Right, and he does TV shows and movies and stuff.
Exactly. So he knows a lot of those people. And so we ended up with a quote from the director of Spider-Verse.
Right.
And Riz Ahmed and Patton Oswalt. And I kind of lost my mind, to be honest. Especially because like one of my favorite Pixar movies is Ratatouille. And Patton Oswalt was the guy who did the voice of Remy. And I just, the thing that I loved telling people is that Remy the Rat gave a quote from my book.
Oh my God. You know, I have to say, one of my great regrets is I had Patton Oswalt on the podcast one time, and I wanted to ask him this question that I've asked many people, which is, would you actually eat at a restaurant that was supposed to be phenomenal if the head chef was a rat? My answer is yes. But I didn't ask Patton. I was going to do it. I'm like, is this unprofessional? No, I can't do that. I can't do that. But I was looking at that. It was the most motley crew and most impressive, like, A-list lineup of pull quotes I'd seen in forever. But the Riz Ahmed one really stood out. I'm like, Peter Ramsey, I'm like, he did Spider-Verse. It's comic related. And then you're like, okay, Patton Oswalt, he does pull quotes for other books, sure. And then I was like, Riz Ahmed? What?
Yeah.
Okay.
I have no idea. I don't know. I'm still disturbed.
It's totally fine. It's totally fine. But okay, let's talk about Felix and Macabber. I'm not going to do the solicit because the solicit is one of the longest solicits I've ever seen in my entire life. It is amazing. But it's you and Hassan Otsmane-Elhaou. It's a new book at Dark Horse. Basically, what it's about is Felix and Macabber are monsters. One is a shy little one in a world where monster wrestling is everything. The other one is one of the most famous monstering champions ever. And Felix and Macabber is about their relationship and how they help each other in the process of getting to know each other. So we know how you two hooked up. But when it came to, you said you talked about your dads and you talked about their, who they were and everything like that. But how did the concept and like the monstering champions, all this stuff, all of these interests that you two have that you smushed together, how did that all come together? Was it just you talking about interests and putting it all together, or what was it?
Yeah, kind of. Because like basically he asked me what I wanted to draw and I said monsters. And then he came up with, okay, so before he was a letterer, he used to make like documentaries and stuff like that.
Right.
And he interviewed wrestlers who all had the same story of essentially giving it their all like for their career, but essentially destroying their private lives in the process because they never really learned how to process their emotions, and they were in a professional environment that encouraged violence and rage as ways of coping with whatever emotions you were feeling.
Also, they have like split lives, like superheroes, where it's like they have a secret identity when they're outside of kayfabe.
Yeah, there's that too. So like essentially the thing that they were all talking about was the young ones were saying, I want to give it my all, and I can see that this or that person in my life isn't happy with how I am, but that's fine. I'm not going to regret it because I'm going to be a great champion or whatever. And then he would talk to the older ones, the ones who were at the end of their careers or had already finished. And they would say, essentially they would regret all the decisions that they had made because they had destroyed their private lives and they had now this career that did not make up for all the stuff that they had lost in the process. And that's how he came up with the story. And Felix was a lot of myself. Like there's a lot of the story about the bullying, the scene with his dad and mom was taken from the situation that I was in, where my dad is not the inspiration for his dad. It's more it's my stepdad, but it's kind of the same principle of like the male figure in your life, essentially. Like what kind of influence do they have? What kind of lessons do they try to give you? And in what kind of way? Because the way they do it is also very different. And so it was essentially a process from then on of either of us coming up with an idea, asking the other one what he thinks, and then we just incorporate it in the book. Either he tells me I came up with this and then I draw something out of it, or I came up with a design or an idea and he finds a way to put it into the story. So the giant dog dragon was my idea of taking his dog and making him huge, and his bit would turn into knights, who would be his. I think the fact that they're kids, that they're his kids, is a Hass's idea. Mm-hmm. So that's a good example. Like I came up with the idea of we're gonna take your dog and we're gonna make him into a dragon, and when he draws, his drool is gonna turn into knights. And he had the idea of making them his children, and the whole number one dad thing, and how it's a contrast with Macabber and how lonely he is. So yeah, a lot of the book was like that.
So it wasn't as clear cut as he was writer and letterer and you were artist. It was like you guys kind of did the story and everything together. And then did like Haas script it, or did you kind of both script it together?
No, he scripted it. Like he is definitely the writer in that he took a bunch of ideas that I had and then he gave them an actual form and made them work together. And honestly, he came up with ideas and like story beats that I would not have thought about.
What's an example that you can share that's not super spoilery?
There's a lot of like little things like storytelling wise, like Macabber leaving town in his car and all the different, like his face changing into a smile as he leaves. That was Hass's idea. There's a bunch of like little storytelling bits. All the relationship he has with Killenver the dog, that's all Hass. Mm-hmm. I would not have written it the same way. I would probably not have even had the idea of making it like that. There's a vibe that's really funny to me because the book is very British in that way, and I'm not British. I would not have been able to make the book as British as he is.
And now, a quick word from one of our sponsors. We're heading into the end of the year, but the campaigns keep launching on Zoop. There's still time to support the legendary Howard Chaykin's campaign and descendant of Bram Stoker, Dacre Stoker's Tale of Dracula, and keeping it spooky as Ghosts from Cullen Bunn and Shannon Eric Denton. Finally, you do not want to miss out on the launch of an artisan edition book featuring John Buscema, Gil Kane, Barry Windsor-Smith, and other A-list artists. Head over to zoop.gg to support the live campaigns and sign up for the ones coming soon. It takes less than 30 seconds to create an account, and the e-commerce style checkout is easy and intuitive. Add multiple rewards and add-ons into your cart, provide some info during checkout, and you're done. No confusing additional steps in finalizing your pledge, and no post-campaign surveys. And of course, every creator appreciates your support. For creators looking to crowdfund your project, Zoop is currently open for submissions. Email them at hello@wearezoop.com to start a campaign. And now, back to the show.
I imagine like the inverse is true, not the British part, but the like the ideas where it's like I imagine there were some parts where like in the script it maybe had dialogue or something like that. Like I'm looking at this one page of the Knights and like basically there's, let's say, 8 total words on the page, but it's, let's see, 8 total panels. And there are like there's this one knight who has a dialogue box that comes up and it's like a laugh cry visual. And then the next one is just a bunch of exclamation points. I'm not sure if that was all in the script, but like to some degree, I imagine it worked the other way where maybe you streamlined things and just turned it down into things like that, where it was more visual based rather than like text based.
Yeah. And plus, like even the script that he would send me did not have any paneling, for example. He would just, unless he had a specific idea, he would let me decide how the paneling would be and what the storytelling bits would be. He just told me what happened and gave me dialogue, and then I figured out how everything would fit together.
Mm-hmm. I think that one of the secret sauces to this book is just Felix is amazing, like just visually speaking. There's something about this kind of like formless form that Felix has where it's just like this face that you can only really see, like the only discernible bits are like eyes and mouth most of the time.
Yeah.
I love that. And like Macabber is great too. The entire cast is great, but Felix is like the exact look you need to get you. I could see there being a plushie of that character, but also I feel like there's something about the character that is so formless that it's impossible to not get invested in them, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's funny because like I keep saying that if that book was to be adapted, I would want it to be done by Studio Laika.
Oh, yeah.
Because stop motion animation. Because for some reason, I do not see it adapted into any other form than stop motion. Like I need a sort of like slightly creepy but kind of cute vibe to it. And I feel like that would be the medium. And that was kind of the driving force for me when I was drawing this, of like everything needs to look a little creepy but really cute.
Yeah. I mean, that's Laika's entire vibe. And I have to say, as a person who has a cat named Kubo, very clearly in support of the Laika of this all.
Yeah.
Obviously, we've talked about like the time gap between making these two projects, but Felix and Macabber is a lot more raw and like pure energy, visually speaking. Was that just because that was where you were at when you were making this book, or is it just more about what this needed?
Kind of both, maybe. When I started working on this book, I was still learning a lot more stuff. I want to say than I am now, more so in the sense of like I was fresh out of school. There's a lot of like really technical stuff that I did not master as well as I do now. So I think it's kind of like I keep making that joke of there's a Naruto character who keeps talking about the energy of youth.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of like that. Like I was younger and I was fresh out of school, and I was even like surprised and really pleased that Has wanted to work with me, because he was one of those people that whose work I really admired.
Sure.
And so it was really a moment of like senpai noticed me for me. Like I really wanted to do something really good, not just for Has, but also just that I had no books made yet. So it was me trying to sort of like show what I could do and put everything that I could into it in a way that I would not necessarily do now, because now I'm a bit more measured, I guess, in what I feel like a book needs.
Is that weird that the book that you did as like kind of your debut effort ends up being like the 4th book you have released?
Yes. One of the fears that I had is Felix having been drawn before anything else. The art is not as technically sound, I guess. At least to me, like I can see where the mistakes are,
Sure.
or where I would have wanted the line work to be more precise or thinner or whatever. So I was kind of insecure about that, and then I ended up thinking, you know what? It actually fits the story and the theme so well that it doesn't really matter anymore. Like it works really well with the subject. And yeah, like I feel like there's also sort of a satisfaction as well. It's sort of the reason why it did not come out before is because we simply did not have the clout to get it done. The reason it exists now is because all the books that have come out since have given us the clout. So that's kind of that's a testament to how much progress Has and I have made.
Yeah. I do think that one thing that's interesting looking at this, though, is And one thing I think that makes it special and it fits the story is it really feels like you two are just having fun on the page and jamming and not thinking as much, but in a good way. Like you're not letting, I don't know, you're letting the ideas flow. Like there's this one part, and this might be me reading too much into it, where Felix makes a fist, and I'm pretty sure it's the Arthur meme, but I don't know if you're actually doing a callback to that or if I'm just reading too much into it.
It wasn't on purpose, but I did notice it, and I was like, yeah, nice, I'm going to keep this.
Yeah, but I mean, that's the thing, though, is like, I remember one time I was talking to, I think it was Carl Kessel, who was a writer, an artist, and he worked on these, like, amalgam comics where they mashed up DC and Marvel characters into these stories, like Legend of the Dark Claw, where it mashes Batman and Wolverine together. And like they're weird comics and it's just kind of goofy. The thing that Carl really struck me that I think is actually a pretty cool thing that kind of fits what you do on this book is he said this line to me where he said, if it makes you laugh, it goes in the book.
Yeah.
I think that there's something to that statement in a broader sense that really works when it comes to comics. It's not just if it makes you laugh. If it really is something you connect with, you put it in the book. And it feels like Felix and Macabber is very much you and Haas, just if it works, it goes in the book.
Yeah. Plus, there was also another element that I think has become kind of a fear for me of we did not know anything in terms of like the technical aspect of things. So what I mean is we had never made a book before, so we didn't really know how you're supposed to make one. We didn't know what the work process was supposed to be. We didn't really know how to like construct a story exactly or a page or whatever. So we just did things in a very intuitive way. That I think as I age and learn more stuff and learn more technical stuff, I'm kind of scared of losing that sort of raw energy about it. It's also why Monkey Meat exists. It's the place where I don't have to think about that stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I just go with whatever I want. Like Monkey Meat is going to be the spiritual successor of like all these things that Felix had started of. If it works, you put it in, if it makes you laugh, or if you think it works, you put it in the book, even if it's weird.
I mean, I think if you lose that part of you, I mean, fundamentally, it's kind of like the love of comics, isn't it? It's just like the thing that makes you really excited about doing what you do. If you lose that, then what do you have?
Yeah, but like I think I'm scared of it because I've seen it in like the example I always give is Tim Burton, because his early movies were very personal, very raw, and also you could sense this vibe of, despite the budget that he has, it was sort of like him and a bunch of people making actual sets and costumes and
right.
Sort of there was I don't want to say DIY exactly, but it was kind of the vibe, you know, like there was an artsy vibe to it that he sort of lost over the years as he became sort of a big shot in Hollywood, and his technology started shifting more towards computers and whatever was easier. And it lost a lot of what made his early movies so physically compelling. Like you watch Batman and you get, you could touch the walls, essentially. You could touch the walls, you feel what you're looking at. Whereas, I don't know, Alice in Wonderland doesn't have that same palpable vibe to it. And I'm kind of scared of that, of like, what if I develop a process where I know so much of the technical stuff and I've done so many books that I sort of lose the raw energy of just doing my own DIY stuff where I just put energy in all kinds of weird ways.
Well, I mean, that can also be done in other ways too. It's like you read Mobilis and like I said, it's like next evolution of the Pokemon Juni. Mm-hmm. And I think the thing about it though is like there's so much still signature you, especially like it's like this is me going way too much amateur psychology, but it's like the ocean scenes, like the bottom of the sea scenes are kind of like pure raw you, and then the Nautilus scenes are kind of you like focusing everything really tight, and like there is that it works really well there because it has both flavors, but also there's like the things like I love the chapter breaks in there. I mean, I know you have chapter breaks regularly, but it really fits this in a really interesting way. And then there's like little like signature things that I think are interesting, like the way you do your eyes, like eyes by itself is like completely different. It's like this kind of cursive version of eye in the lettering. You lettered Mobilis, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's like the eye is like a completely different font than everything else. So there's little things where it's just like these bursts of artistry that are still raw and still energetic, but aren't necessarily the same way. It's just like you kind of tightening the beam, if you will.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, there was a lot of like trying to sort of give me guidelines to follow in this one.
Yeah.
The one I'm doing right now, yeah, the two of the ones that I'm doing right now have guidelines as well. But that also means that when you get to lash out, you lash out a lot more.
Is it weird for you looking back on Felix and Macabber just because it was just a earlier project for you? Not that you don't recognize the work, but like it's hard to look because, as many have said, all you see is the mistakes.
No, I'm good. Like, yeah, I can see the technical mistakes, but there's also, yeah, the thing that I mentioned about like the youthful energy of it is something that I really don't want to lose. I have a folder full of old drawings specifically for that reason. Like, it's stuff that I guess technically isn't as good as what I would draw today, but it has that sort of like free energy of just do whatever you want. But there's still something very precious to gain from looking at it, even just as a reminder of, oh yeah, this is what I wanted to do in the first place, before this became an actual job that I have to like get up in the morning to do.
And break up your hours of watching Mindhunter.
Yeah.
Just a couple more questions. I did want to ask, I don't know if this is something you can really see in yourself. How do you think you've changed as a cartoonist in the past few years? Like, do you think that you felt like you've made some real growth, or is that not really how you think about what you do?
My obsession is always with how insecure I am about my art and how I want to improve it all the time. And my storytelling. Like I very often look at other people's drawings and I'm like, I don't draw as well as this person. Or the weird thing where I'm like, I want to draw like this person. And then I look at another drawing by someone else and I'm like, I want to draw like this person. But those two drawings don't look anything like each other. And I was talking about it with Aditya Bidikar, who essentially told me, yeah, it's normal to feel insecure, but look at the stuff that you're looking at. Like you're looking at Darwin Cook and Chris Samney. It's normal to feel insecure when you're looking at those people. Like, no wonder you feel insecure when you look at those people. Like, but he essentially reassured me, telling me, like, yeah, if you compare to a bunch of other artists, you're actually really good and even better than a lot of them. But yeah, you're always going to feel insecure if you compare yourself to like the gods, essentially.
Yeah.
So I would say most of my change has been that I've become more confident in my skills. I think experience also gave me an idea of where I want to improve, in the sense that right now, even the new thing that I do is that I print pages or covers by other artists. And when I draw my pages, I look at theirs to see how they drew, I don't know, clothes or whatever, just to see how they solved the problem of how do you simplify this? How do you draw this? And it's really useful. Like it just in 2 issues, it taught me a lot. Mm-hmm. And I find that a way more healthy and way more satisfying way of dealing with my insecurities. So yeah, like I guess it's this meme from like in the TV show Insecure. Like one of the characters is like, you know what that is? Growth. And that's how I feel.
I think Aditya is correct, but I also want to emphasize, not only are they really good, Darwin and Chris, but they're also like, Chris has been drawing comics for like, I don't know, as long as you've been alive. And like Darwin was like, you know, a extreme veteran creator. It took him a long time to get there. Like if you look at Chris's Queen and Country, it's like Chris didn't have everything figured out. It was really good because it's Chris Samney, but at the same time, it's like everyone grows. If you keep doing that growth, you will maybe get there as well. But tying into that, like last question I have for you is, we've talked about how you decide your projects, and you have had a big past few years. I mean, you've had basically 4 graphic novels worth of comics in our perceived time of like a little over like 2 years in terms of releases. You've been taking on a lot of different projects outside of that too. I mentioned 3 Worlds, 3 Moons, but you got covers, you got all kinds of stuff. You got secret piles of comics behind you. What do you want for yourself next? What are you aiming for as a storyteller? Is it more about just whatever speaks to you, or what's driving you as you move into the next steps and try to find out what does the future look like for you?
Okay, so looking back on the stuff that I've been, especially the stuff that I've been writing, I can already see some things that tend to come back, like themes or storytelling tricks, or like, for example, for some reason, I really like having a character looking at a portrait in the beginning of the story. I don't know why, I just like it as a visual motif.
Sure. But
it's just an example of like the things that, looking back at my work, I can see, okay, these are the things that I tend to get back to, or like parent-child relationships or insecurity around your effect on other people and stuff like that. And so I don't necessarily have an objective as such. I just know that I want to try to make stories about different things as well. Like I'm getting to the point where I've been making so many things back to back. Like at some point you need to sit down and sort of take stock of everything you did and voluntarily decide to go in a different direction just so you can renew yourself.
Yeah. I mean, we were talking before we started recording. Sometimes it's good to take a break and get out there and see what the world has to offer. And then maybe you'll find that you have a new inspiration that you didn't expect.
Yeah. And reading stuff and watching stuff. Like I'm watching Mindhunter and I finished it today. Really instructive and gave me some ideas. I'm starting the Earthsea books. I never read them before. So like it's a list of things like that of like, creatively speaking, I want to try and expand outside of the stuff that I do instinctively without thinking about it, because if you don't pay attention to that, you kind of just end up talking about the same things over and over again.
Absolutely. Well, I suspect that whatever you give us next will be something that is completely different than everything we might expect. But Juni, that is all I have for you. Thank you so much for coming on and talked about Mobilis, Felix and Macabber, and everything else. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Off Panel with cartoonist Juni Ba. You can find his work in Mobilis at TKO Studios and The Unlikely Story of Felix and Macabber at Dark Horse. Shouts to Deanna Chapman for stepping in to edit this week's podcast. If it sounds better than usual, it's because of her. Love Off Panel and want to support it? Subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts today and give the show a rating and review while you're at it, but 5 stars only. You can also support the show by backing it on Patreon. Find the show at patreon.com/offpanel. And when you back it on there, you get early access to each week's podcast as well as weekly content and more. Want even more? Subscribe to my subscription comic site Sketched at sketch.com for long-form articles, interviews, and the rest of the site's content. You can find Off Panel and Sketched on social media by following on Twitter and Instagram at SketchComic or following me at @SliceFriedGold. Big thanks to all my existing patrons, including Jeremy Thomas Burke, Jared Schwab, Scott Dunn, Chip Mosher, Alan Ellsworth, Seth Pomeroy, James McEwen, Kenny Myers, Andrew Lehman, Christina Merkler, Mike Cancel, Scott Place, Darcy Van Polgees, Travis Schmeiser, Tom Evans, Natalie Mockery, Reed Beeman, Kelly Sudakana, Max Wood, Jeremy Lambert, Brian Hull, Matteo Ciccati, Chris Doré, Nir Levy, Dennis Hoffman, Jason Hussa, Kieran Gillen, Jonathan Kent Uratam, Henry Johnson, Django Boren, James Tynan IV, Chris Langford, Jason Wood, Tom Peachy, Ben Damstead, Ron V, Nick Walker, Patrick Coyle, Isaac Oren, Scott Carpenter, Rent Narb Studios Comics, Capes and Tights Podcast, Klaus Vandeven, Brian, Submit Industries, Jack Mulqueen, Kyle, Carl Kerschel, Robert Masella, Elza Chartier, Luke Nakashoji, Dr. Luke, Scott Hazelwood, Canadian by Proxy, Bradley Rader, Carl Troy, Brandon DePillis, Patrick Brower, Declan Shalvey, Dan Garino, Adam Freeman, Ben Wild, Brian Clan Q, Nick Bennett, Birdcage Comics Cafe, Susanna Polo, Reed Hinkley Barnes, Mario Tiambang, Andrew Carita, Matt Mahoney, Stephen Hull, Phil Myra, Chris Pachalo, Torrin Grunbeck, Buzz Bubbles, Christopher Todd, Transmitter Down, Waltz Comics and Books, Akil Wilson, Alex Dimitriopoulos, Terry Dodson, Wesley Giff, Sean Kirkham, Julio Anta, Brett A. Schmidt, Jason Goodmanson, Paul Reinwan, Vida Ayala, Akil, Philip Seavey, Al Ewing, Ryan Alcock, David Kelly, Nick Polito, Brett Matthew Groom, Jason Massey, Adam Bogert, Matthew Taylor, Nick Patera, Jacob Sorelli, Ford Gilmore, David Baraldi, Nick Hall, Bjorn Basin, John Hendricks, Steve Anderson, Ian Maxfield, Cliff Chang, Carl McMahon, Scott McGovern, Nathan Fairbairn, Adam Highfield, Fiona Staples, Mark Abnett, Michael Shirley, Tom Barnett, Jim Demonakos, Norbert, Nick Lowe, James Kaplan, and Mission Comics and Art in San Francisco. You guys are all the best. A quick thanks to Wolfpack for letting me use their song Outro as the show's opening theme, and to Upright T-Rex Music, who wrote and performed Off Panel's outro and ad music just for the show. Check out their music on Spotify because it's completely delightful. Thanks for listening, and tune in next week for another episode.